throw some stuff out there first. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to do three things to start our class off today. I'm going to read a few quotes from the assigned reading today, and then I'm going to pose some questions we might take up in the discussion, and then I'm going to conclude with some broad reflections of my own and thoughts on the seminar. But I wanted to open with a quote from Stephen Melville's 2012 essay, Intention, Interpretation, and the Balance of Theory, which was also published on the Nonsite website, which is where our, the essay that we read for today was published. And this quote is actually in the collected kind of quotes that we circulated on the Google Drive. And so the quote starts out with, the Tony Smith quote that we've touched on before. There's no way to frame it, you just have to experience it. And now here's Melville's commentary on that line. Quote, "It's clear that Freed finds this sentence deeply problematic, finds it, in fact, unacceptable. The time since 1967 is the time of that sentence's historical success in spite of Freed's objection. The question for us is exactly what that objection is," close quote. So yeah, that was kind of just the quote I wanted to kind of have preside over what's to follow. And then, with regards to the reading for today, Melville's Art and Objecthood word by word, I wanted to read what I take to be, kind of the four most crucial paragraphs of the essay. And the first three of these quotes are located in the second part of the piece, so part two, if you want to follow along. So in these first three quotes, Melville is aiming at Freed's commentary on Tony Smith's account of his drive along the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. And Melville writes, quote, "Freed's procedure here only makes sense if Freed takes it that experience does not exist outside its framing or articulation. To have an experience is to articulate it. Tony Smith wants not to believe this, so is obliged to understand his own sentence as at once excessive and unnecessary. It is intended, like Smith's work itself, as the guardian of that experience in its ineffability and withdrawal. But this means that he does not and cannot take his words and his work seriously, that is, Smith. Freed wants his reader to see the seriousness of that failure. The reader is to hear Smith's words as Smith himself evidently cannot. One might imagine the commentary, so Freed's commentary, could be short-circuited by simply reading the sentence aloud so as to hear it hollowing itself out. This is the general work of quotation throughout Art and Objecthood. It asks the reader to attend to the artist's various comments, so the artists that are, that litter the whole essay, right? It asks the reader to attend to the artist's various comments in ways many readers evidently find difficult, not as descriptions of the work or as reports on an intention or as evidence for a view of or theory about art, but as expressions, voicings, unfoldings, word by word, of their work and experience. The job is to make palpable a certain self-baffling vicissitude of expression that is at once excessive and evasive, simultaneously asserting and withholding the experience it cannot claim and so fails to express. This failure is not descriptive, that is, not something to be measured against the experience, but internal to the experience itself. Our experience can be lost in us, and in doing so, it does not simply fall away. In seeing how quotation functions in Art and Objecthood, we are, of course, also already caught up in the larger work se argument of the essay. We are already prepared to see how minimalist work participates in and continues, monumentalizes, a complex failure of experience that is equally, inseparably, and above all, a failure of expression. Because experience and its expression are internally bound in this way, this failure cannot be pointed to from, as it were, the outside. Criticism has to work itself out, find its voice from within that failure. And now the final quote I'm going to intone from this piece is at the start of part 4 of our Objecthood word by word. And this kind of continues with Melville's kind of exploration of this idea of expression in Art and Objecthood. So here's Melville, quote, "In its writing, Art and Objecthood is deeply responsive to and actively enforces a demand for absolute expressivity, notably intolerant of any forms of withdrawal or avoidance, as well as of the various forms of excess and concealment that they may sketch in counterpart. This demand, as it is at work in Art and Objecthood, appears both aesthetic and ethical, with this relation kept more or less continuously in view by the web of analogies, references, and points of focus the essay weaves into its fabric. Needless to say, this demand is, in both artistic and human registers, a hard, sometimes brutally hard demand, and it will seem particularly hard where we believe we have good reason to be baffled in ourselves or circumstances. Certainly our sense of the constitutive depth of such bafflement and comparting of our finitude has only grown sharper over the course of Art and Objecthood's 50 years. And now, so I'm going to turn to kind of like the second part of just what I want to throw out there, namely, just some kind of questions and concerns we might consider in relation to this essay. Something we might consider is what Melville calls, quote, the very failure Art and Objecthood needs to diagnose, which Melville, quoting Fried, identifies pithily as, quote, "we are all literalists most or all of our lives," close quote. This failure might be summarized in brief as the failure of expression, or the failure of having our experience. So I don't want to get too deep into the matter of Hegel's philosophy of art, which would, of course, put us too far afield from Art and Objecthood, but I think the important point concerning Hegel as regards the material we are examining in this seminar is as follows. Against what he calls Arthur Danto's soft Hegelianism, in which the subject is emptied out, Melville is advancing a strongly or openly Hegelian reading of Fried's Art and Objecthood, and Fried's larger body of work more generally. This is a reading that places emphasis on the theme of experience and its disproof, a theme that is notably one step removed from the Kantian direct address of one's object. So we might say that Melville is, interested in the Hegelian grammar of Art and Objecthood, and I think that's, one maybe good way of approaching this piece that we read for today. Something we might also consider is the following question I raised in the second session, namely, how is Melville allegorizing Art and Objecthood? Or alternatively, what kind of work does he want the essay to do? What kind of lesson does he want it to teach us? This is then to seriously consider what we are calling the legacy of the essay, the enduring claim it has upon us. And from this perspective, we might ask, how does that essay, notwithstanding all its shortcomings and blindnesses, task us? On a more practical level, Melville shows us, through his various writings over the past half-century, that some kind of an engagement with Art and Objecthood is essential for judgment and art criticism to carry on in the present, for criticism to have some traction vis-a-vis contemporary art. Melville is definitely not trying to resolve the problems in questions of Art and Objecthood, but prolong their unease, as he began doing in the notes essay we read. In the first class, I mentioned that Melville's body of work effectively proposes the idea of teaching art history and approaching contemporary art through Fried's Art and Objecthood. What are the merits or potential pitfalls of this approach, of taking such a tack? Something that I find really interesting that Melville insists on is that if we readers allow for Fried to correct Tony Smith's experience, we must also be open to that as readers too. In this light, Fried in Art and Objecthood would seem to be trying to instigate a certain conversion in us or acknowledgement. And lastly, does Melville's account of the difficulties of reading the essay resonate with your own experience of reading the text? Kind of like the elephant in the room. How much does this essay really reflect what it's like reading the text? And then, in closing, just to kind of wrap things up, I have a few kind of broad reflections on the class as a whole. Excuse me if these kind of, indulge in some tangents. In reflecting on this seminar, I found myself mulling over how much of this class has, in a sense, been an exploration of the logic of supplementarity, an exploration of the logic of the supplement, where each successive text attempts to think or rethink the conditions of possibility of the preceding text. In other words, attempts to think the former text's own unthought in relation to subsequent history. This dynamic was set in motion at the outset of the seminar with Smithson's response to Fried, despite, obviously Smithson's response being immediate, which no doubt points to, at least in my mind, the depth of Smithson's own itinerary. And Melville will aptly identify Smithson as Art and Objecthood's, quote, first acutely savage reader. Smithson's text is a veritable maelstrom that sucks Fried into a cosmos not of his own choosing. And so here's another reflection that, I thought might be helpful. There is a deep affinity between French theory and Fried's project, one that we maybe should have spelled out at the outset. If Heidegger can be said to be concerned with our human presence in and to the world, which amounts to what he calls care, Dasein literally meaning being there, Derrida, the most acutely savage reader of Heidegger, may be said to problematize such presence by showing how presence is always contaminated and invaded by non-presence or absence. Derrida and following him, Jean-Luc Nancy, are concerned with the impossibility of presence. And I think this might go towards explaining how continental theory helps Stephen Melville undertake a deconstruction of Fried. Presentness is grace, then, the infamous or famous closing line of Art and Objecthood, then isn't a major chord, to use a musical metaphor. It's actually something maybe closer to a diminished chord, or something I think Miles Davis would know very well how to hit. Presentness is grace has a certain uneasiness to it. It's almost like Fried thinks he has hit a major chord, or a chord that would resolve things at the end of Art and Objecthood, but it doesn't quite work this way, or the way he would like it to work. So in a sense, what we have been engaged in this seminar is deconstructing Fried, trying to read Fried against the grain, or alternatively, trying to think with and against Fried at the same time. As the class has progressed, the matter of language has slowly seeped its way into our discussions. And I think if this seminar had been longer, say 8 weeks long, we would have probably turned to deal more explicitly with questions of language and legibility, such as they are dealt with, for instance, in Melville's essay Aspects. And if there are any students that are interested in mining this topic further, namely, how language and legibility figure into all of the stuff we've been talking about, I'd be happy to suggest more readings after the class is done. On this issue of language and its relation to art, I've been finding myself coming back to this line from a different essay of Melville's, where he writes that, quote, art's history matters because it is the concrete working through of thought's radical answerability to the world, the necessity of our speaking, close quote. And then just kind of a few last thoughts to kind of get us launched, to launch this discussion. I thought it was worth pausing over the shift we saw in our second session from a non-judgmental historical approach to Cindy Sherman to a judgmental approach, which was accomplished in Sean's move to judge Sherman's work now in the present, which we can contrast to my more historical appraisal of her work in relation to the idea of allegory as I was exploring it in my presentation during the second session. And so, this gets at the fundamental difference Fried insists upon between the modes of art history on the one hand and art criticism on the other, and how judgment figures into each of them. And to go back to the matter of conviction that was raised during our last session, there's a line of Stanley Cavell's that I think is particularly apt from the essay Music Discomposed, where he writes, quote, "The task of the modern artist, as of the modern man, is to find something he can be sincere and serious in." And Stephen Melville he makes a big deal about this difference between Cavell saying serious in versus serious about, that there's a certain, kind of existential register to Cavell's phrasing, serious in, that Melville will link to kind of the way in which Derrida plays with inside and outside. And lastly, what also came to mind almost inevitably in kind of mulling over this idea of conviction that came up last class was Yeats' famous line, quote, "The best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity." A quote that I think, definitely resonates with our current moment, but is interesting also to think about in the context of Fried and how we're kind of wrestling with his legacy. So that's kind of everything I kind of wanted to just throw out and kind of get out of the way before we kind of jump into a discussion. But I guess, to return to the question I posed at the end of, how does, I got a number of responses from students in their reading responses that were kind of commenting on how, reading this essay at the very end of this class was clearly purposeful on our parts, that in some ways it serves as a certain coda for the class that also returns us to kind of the opening launching of this course. So in some ways we're returning to that experience of reading Fried. I guess I'm curious, I've already heard from a number of folks about how, being a first-time reader of this essay, that Melville's description of the difficulties of reading the text very much resonated with their own. But I'm curious if maybe there are any students who didn't find Melville's Art and Objecthood word by word, resonating with their own experience, or just any maybe different responses to that essay.
Real quick before that, I was wondering if you could briefly say what experience and its disproof refers to.
Yeah, so that's so in Hegel, his kind of most famous book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. It's as if the engine of his philosophy is, a lot of people have kind of written about how in Hegel the knowledge and knowledge's disproof, in other words, the way in which human knowledge can be disproven over time, that is registered in Hegel as despair, right? He's able to kind of connect how these moments of the unfolding of consciousness over the course of human history are kind of riven with these moments of untruth or the falsification of what we think to be true. And those moments are experienced phenomenologically, as a certain despair or a certain kind of coming to grief, or however you want to put it. And I think, so for me at least, having read Hegel for a long time, I think this idea, or this thematic of experience and then experience revealing itself to be somehow falsified or the kind of undermining of one's own conviction, we could say, maybe in a Freudian register. That is in some ways, a big engine of Hegel's entire kind of system or body of thought. And I think in some ways what Melville is doing is showing how there's a kind of a experiential core to art and objecthood that I think for him is kind of irreducible. That Freud is trying to show how there's this kind of tension in especially the account of Tony Smith, of how Freud is showing how, Tony Smith's own account of the origin of his work, of the drive along the unfinished New Jersey highway, is at once, it claims a certain kind of truth of experience, and then also has a way of undermining that in the very articulation of that experience, right? And I think in some ways that's kind of this like hard kernel of the essay for Melville. And, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to hear what people think of that and whether it resonates with people and their experience of the reading. And I don't know how helpful that exposition of experience and its disproof is, but I don't know.